Ooh, ha, ha. All right, bitches, we're gonna read. We're gonna read this motherfucker. Chapter 1: The Characteristics of Propaganda. Here. 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 Wait, am I not live? I should be live. What? I'm not seeing my stream on my channel. Oh, there it is. Okay. I'm gonna go post a link. Leaving with Cal? What the fuck are you talking about? What the hell is wrong with people? Fucking dumbass. Alright. Alright, Chapter 1: The Characteristics of Propaganda. True modern propaganda can only function within the context of the modern scientific system. What? What? But what is it? Many observers look upon propaganda as a collection of gimmicks and of more or less serious practices. Most French psychologists and psychosociologists do not regard propaganda as a serious practice or as having much influence. What? Are you fucking kidding me? And psychologists and sociologists very often reject the scientific character of these practices. For our part, we completely agree that propaganda is a technique rather than a science. In this connection, Albig is right to stress that propaganda cannot be a science because in the field in which it applies, there can be neither valid generalizations nor constant factors. Spelling is grammar. But it is a modern technique, that is, it is based on one or more branches of science. Propaganda is the expression of these branches of science. It moves with them, shares in their successes, and bears witness to their failures. The time is past when propaganda was a matter of individual inspiration, personal subtlety, or the use of unsophisticated tricks. Now science has entered propaganda, as we shall reveal from 4 different points of view. First of all, modern propaganda is based on scientific analysis of psychology and sociology. Step by step, the propagandist builds his techniques on the basis of his knowledge of man, his tendencies, his desires, his needs, his psychic mechanisms, his conditioning, and as much on social psychology as on depth psychology. He shapes his procedures on the basis of our knowledge of groups and their laws of formation and dissolution, of mass influences, and of environmental limitations. Without the scientific research of modern psychology and sociology, there would be no propaganda, or rather, we still would be in the primitive stages of propaganda that existed in the time of Pericles or Augustus. Of course, propagandists may be insufficiently versed in these branches of science. They may misunderstand them, go beyond the cautious conclusions of the psychologists, or claim to apply certain psychological discoveries that, in fact, do not apply at all. But all this only shows efforts to find new ways. Only for the past 50 years have men sought to apply the psychological and sociological sciences. The important thing is that propaganda has decided to submit itself to science and to make use of it. Of course, psychologists may be scandalized and say that this is a misuse of their science. But this argument carries no weight. The same applies to our physicists and the atomic bomb. The scientist should know that he lives in a world in which his discoveries will be utilized. Propagandists inevitably will have a better understanding of sociology and psychology, use them with increasing precision, and as a result become more effective. Second, propaganda is scientific in that it tends to establish a set of rules, rigorous, precise, and tested, that are not merely recipes, but impose themselves on every propagandist who is less and less free to follow his own impulses. He must apply increasingly and exactly certain precise formulas that can be applied by anybody with the proper training, clearly a characteristic of a technique based on science. Third, what is needed nowadays is an exact analysis of both the environment and the individual to be subjected to propaganda. No longer does the man of talent determine the method, the approach, or the subject. All that is now being calculated, or must be calculated. Therefore, one type of propaganda will be found suitable in one situation and completely useless in another. To undertake an active propaganda operation, it is necessary to make a scientific, sociological, and psychological analysis first, and then utilize those branches of science which are becoming increasingly well known. But here, again, Proper training is necessary for those who want to use them with their full effectiveness. Finally, one last trait reveals the scientific character of modern propaganda: the increasing attempt to control its use, measure its results, define its effects. This is very difficult, but the propagandist is no longer content to have obtained or to believe he has obtained a certain result. He seeks precise evidence. Even successful political results do not completely satisfy him. He wants to understand the how and the why of them and measure their exact effect. He is prompted by a certain spirit of experimentation and a desire to ponder the results. From this point on, one can see the beginning of scientific method. Admittedly, it is not yet very widespread, and those who analyze results are not active propagandists, but philosophers. Granted, that reveals a certain division of labor, nothing more. It indicates that propaganda is no longer a self-contained action covering up for evil deeds. It is an object of serious thought and proceeds along scientific channels. Some people object to this. One frequently hears psychologists ridicule the claim to a scientific basis advanced by the propagandists and reject the latter's claims of having employed scientific techniques. The psychology he uses is not scientific psychology. The sociology he uses is not scientific sociology. But after a careful look at the controversy, one comes to this conclusion: Stalinist propaganda was in great measure founded on Pavlov's theory of the conditioned reflex. Hitlerian propaganda was in great measure founded on Freud's theory of repression and libido. American propaganda is founded in great measure on Dewey's theory of teaching. Now, if a psychologist does not accept the idea of the conditioned reflex and doubts that it can be created in man, he then rejects Pavlov's interpretation of psychological phenomena and concludes that all propaganda based on it is pseudoscientific. It is obviously the same for those who question the findings of Freud, Dewey, or anybody else. What does this mean, then? That propaganda does not rest on a scientific base? Certainly not. Rather, that scientists are not agreed among themselves on the domains, methods, or conclusions of psychology and sociology. A psychologist who rejects the theory of one of his colleagues rejects a scientific theory and not merely the inferences that a technician may draw from it. One cannot blame the propagandist if he has confidence in a particular sociologist or psychologist whose theory is generally accepted and who is, at a given time and in a given country, considered a scientist. Moreover, let us not forget that if this theory, put to use by the propagandist, brings results and proves to be effective, it thereby receives additional confirmation, and that simple doctrinal criticism can then no longer demonstrate its inaccuracy. I need to wet my throat. I don't think I have water here. I'll go to the bathroom too. you, baby. Hi. I love you. Yeah. I love you. Hi. Good boy. Good boy. What you doing? What are you doing? Hi. Hey, baby. Hi, good boy. Good boy. Hi. You want to learn about propaganda? Do you want to learn, baby? I will teach you. I will teach you the way. Yes. Good boy. Good boy. Good boy. Hey. Oh, I'm reading a book, baby. Hey. Hey. Good boy. You're so nice. Holy shit, it's already the middle of the month. Good boy. Good boy. Can I weed? Ready? External characteristics. The individual and the masses. Any modern propaganda will first of all address itself at one and the same time to the individual and to the masses. It cannot separate the two elements. For propaganda to address itself, the individual in his isolation apart from the crowd is impossible. The individual is of no interest to the propagandist. As an isolated unit, he presents much too much resistance to external action. To be effective, propaganda cannot be concerned with detail, not only because to win men over one by one takes much too long, but also because to create certain convictions in an isolated individual is much too difficult. Propaganda ceases where simple dialogue begins. And that is why, in particular experiments undertaken in the United States to gauge the effectiveness of certain propaganda methods or arguments on isolated individuals are not conclusive. They do not reproduce the real propaganda situation. Conversely, propaganda does not aim simply at the mass, the crowd. A propaganda that functioned only where individuals are gathered together would be incomplete and insufficient. Also, any propaganda aimed only at groups as such, as if a mass were a specific body having a soul and reactions and feelings entirely different from individual souls, reactions, and feelings, would be an abstract propaganda that likewise would have no effectiveness. Modern propaganda reaches individuals enclosed in the mass and as participants in that mass, yet it also aims at a crowd, but only as a body composed of individuals. What does this mean? First of all, that the individual never is considered as an individual, but always in terms of what he has in common with others, such as his motivations, his feelings, or his myths. He is reduced to an average, and except for a small percentage action based on averages will be effectual. Moreover, the individual is considered part of the mass and included in it, and so far as possible systematically integrated into it, because in that way his psychic defenses are weakened, his reactions are easier to provoke, and the propagandist profits from the process of diffusion of emotions through the mass, and at the same time from the pressure felt by an individual when in a group. Emotionalism, impulsiveness, excess, All these characteristics of the individual caught up in a mass are well known and very helpful to propaganda. Therefore, the individual must never be considered as being alone. The listener to a radio broadcast, though actually alone, is nevertheless part of a large group, and he is aware of it. Radio listeners have been found to exhibit a mass mentality. All are tied together and constitute a sort of society in which all individuals are accomplices and influence each other without knowing it. The same holds true for propaganda that is carried on by door-to-door visits, direct contacts, petitions for signatures. Although apparently one deals here with a single individual, one deals in reality with a unit submerged into an indivisible crowd composed of all those who have been interviewed, who are being interviewed, and who will be interviewed, because they hold similar ideas and live by the same myths, and especially because they are targets of the same organism. Being the target of a party or an administration is enough to immerse the individual in that sector of the population which the propagandist has in his sights. This simple fact makes the individual part of the mass. He is no longer Mr. X, but part of a current flowing in a particular direction. The current flows through the canvasser, who is not a person speaking in his own name with his own arguments, but one segment of an administration, an organization, a collective movement. When he enters a room to canvass a person, the mass, and moreover the organized, leveled mass, enters with him. No relationship exists here between man and man. The organization is what exerts its attraction on an individual already part of a mass, because he is in the same sights as all others being canvassed. You okay, bud? Conversely, when propaganda is addressed to a crowd, it must touch each individual in that crowd, in that whole group, to be effective. It must give the impression of being personal, for we must never forget that the mass is composed of individuals and is in fact nothing but assembled individuals. Actually, just because men are in a group and therefore weakened, receptive, and in a state of psychological regression, they pretend all the more to be strong individuals. The mass man is clearly subhuman, but pretends to be Superman. He is more suggestible, but insists he is more forceful. He is more unstable, but thinks he is firm in his convictions. If one openly treats the mass as a mass, the individuals who form it will feel themselves belittled and will refuse to participate. If one treats these individuals as children, and they are children because they are in a group, they will not accept their leader's projections or identify with him. They will withdraw, and we will not be able to get anything out of them. On the contrary, each one must feel individualized. Each must have the impression that he is being looked at, that he is being addressed personally. Only then will he respond and cease to be anonymous, although in reality remaining anonymous. Interesting. Thus, all modern propaganda profits from the structure of the mass, but exploits the individual's need for self-affirmation, and the two actions must be conducted jointly, simultaneously. Of course, this operation is greatly facilitated by the existence of the modern mass media of communication, which have precisely this remarkable effect of reaching the whole crowd all at once, and yet reaching each one in that crowd. Readers of the evening paper, radio listeners, movie or TV viewers certainly constitute a mass that has an organic existence, although it is diffused and not assembled at one point. These individuals are moved by the same motives, receive the same impulses and impressions, find themselves focused on the same centers of interest, experience the same feelings, have generally the same order of reactions and ideas, participate in the same myths, and all this at the same time. What we have here is really a psychological, if not a biological mass, and the individuals in it are modified by this existence even if they do not know it. Yet each one is alone. The newspaper reader, the radio listener, he therefore feels himself individually concerned as a person, as a participant. The movie spectator also is alone, though elbow to elbow with his neighbors. He still is, because of the darkness and the hypnotic attraction of the screen, perfectly alone. This is the situation of a lonely crowd, or of isolation in the mass, which is a natural product of present-day society, and which is both used and deepened by the mass media. The most favorable moment to seize a man and influence him is when he is alone in the mass. It is at this point that propaganda can be most effective. We must emphasize this circle which we shall meet again and again. The structure of present-day society places the individual where he is most easily reached by propaganda. The media of mass communication, which are part of the technical evolution of this society, deepens this situation while making it possible to reach the individual man integrated in the mass, and what these media do is exactly what propaganda must do in order to attain its objectives. In reality, propaganda cannot exist without using these mass media. If by chance propaganda is addressed to an organized group, it can have practically no effect on individuals before that group has been fragmented. Edward A. Shills must have demonstrated the importance of the group in the face of propaganda. The Germans, they claim, did not yield earlier in World War II because the various groups of their military structure held fast. Propaganda cannot do much when the social group has not disintegrated. The play of opinions has relatively little importance. Such fragmentation can be achieved through action, but it is equally possible to fragment a group by psychological means. The transformation of very small groups by purely psychological means is one of the most important techniques of propaganda. Only when very small groups are thus annihilated, when the individual finds no more defenses, no equilibrium, no resistance exercised by the group to which he belongs, does total action by propaganda become possible. Total propaganda. Propaganda must be total. The propagandist must utilize all of the technical means at his disposal. The press, the radio, TV, movies, posters, meetings, door-to-door canvassing. Modern propaganda must utilize all these media. There is no propaganda as long as one makes use, in sporadic fashion and at random, Okay, where was I? There is no propaganda as long as one makes use in sporadic fashion and at random of a newspaper article here, a poster or radio program there, organizes a few meetings and lectures, writes a few slogans on the walls. That is not propaganda. Each usable medium has its own particular way of penetration, specific but at the same time localized. and limited. By itself, it cannot attack the individual, break down his resistance, make his decisions for him. A movie does not play on the same motives, does not produce the same feelings, does not provoke the same reactions as a newspaper. The very fact that the effectiveness of each medium is limited to one particular area clearly shows the necessity of complementing it with another media. A word spoken on the radio is not the same, does not produce the same effect, does not have the same impact as the identical words spoken in private conversation or in public speech before a large crowd. To draw the individual into the net of propaganda, each technique must be utilized in its own specific way, directed toward producing the effect it can best produce, and fused with all the other media, each of them reaching the individual in a specific fashion and making him react anew to the same theme in the same directions, but differently. Thus, one leaves no part of the intellectual or emotional life alone. Man is surrounded on all sides, man and men, for we must also bear in mind that these media do not all reach the same public in the same way. Those who go to the movies 3 times a week are not the same people who read the newspapers with care. The tools of propaganda are thus oriented in terms of their public and must be used in a concentrated fashion to reach the greatest possible number of individuals. For example, the poster is a popular medium for reaching those without automobiles. Radio newscasts are listened to in the better circles. We must note, finally, that each medium includes a third aspect of specialization, saving for later our analysis of the fact that there are quite diverse forms of propaganda. Each medium is particularly suited to a certain type of propaganda. The movies and human contacts are the best media for sociological propaganda in terms of social climate, slow infiltration, progressive inroads, and overall integration. Public meetings and posters are more suitable tools for providing shock propaganda, intense but temporary, leading to immediate action. The press tends to shape general views. Radio is likely to be an instrument of international action and psychological warfare, whereas the press is used domestically. In any case, it is understood that because of this specialization, not one of these instruments may be left out. They must all be used in combination. The propagandist uses a keyboard and composes a symphony. It is a matter of reaching and encircling the whole man and all men. Propaganda tries to surround men by all possible routes, in the realm of feelings as well as ideas, by playing on his will or on his needs, through his conscious and his unconscious assailing him in both his private and his public life. It furnishes him with a complete system for explaining the world and provides immediate incentives to action. We are here in the presence of an organized myth that tries to take hold of the entire person. Through the myth it creates propaganda. Propaganda imposes a complete range of intuitive knowledge, susceptible of only one interpretation, unique and one-sided, and precluding any divergence. This myth becomes so powerful that it invades every area of consciousness, leaving no faculty or motivation intact. It stimulates in the individual a feeling of exclusiveness and produces a biased attitude. The myth has such motive force that once accepted, it controls the whole of the individual and becomes who becomes immune to any other influence. This explains the totalitarian attitude that the individual adopts wherever a myth has been successfully created, and that simply reflects the totalitarian action of propaganda on him. Huh. The myth. Ah. This explains a totalitarian attitude. So the propaganda creates a myth, becomes so powerful that it invades every area of consciousness, leaving no faculty or motivation intact. It stimulates in the individual a feeling of exclusiveness and produces a biased attitude. A feeling of exclusiveness. Like, I'm the only one who has this truth. The myth is such a motive force that once accepted, it controls the whole of the individual, who becomes immune to any other influence. Like, that's why no one will listen to you. This explains the totalitarian attitude. Wherever the myth has been successfully created, through the myth it creates, propaganda imposes a complete range of intuitive knowledge susceptible of only one interpretation, unique and one-sided, and precluding any divergence. So they won't listen to any. They won't listen to anyone who has a different interpretation. Amazing. I mean, this makes so much sense, because it's like, that's why when I talk to people, it's like they can't even they don't even have the ability to like see where I'm coming from, because I guess they have, the propagandists created this myth in their head, so they're susceptible to only one interpretation. That's so fucked. That's so fucked, because I see, that's why I literally present evidence that goes against what someone's myth tells them to believe, and they look at the evidence and interpret it to support them. That's fucking crazy. They can do that. That's crazy. Not only does propaganda seek to invade the whole man, to lead him to adopt a mystical attitude and reach him through all possible psychological channels, but more, it speaks to all men. Propaganda cannot be satisfied with partial successes, for it does not tolerate discussion. By its very nature, it excludes contradiction and discussion. Ah. As long as a noticeable or expressed tension or a conflict of action remains, propaganda cannot be said to have accomplished its aim. It must produce quasi-unanimity, and the opposing faction must become negligible, or in any case cease to be vocal. Extreme propaganda must win over the adversary and at least use him by integrating him into its own frame of reference. That's why it is so important to have an Englishman speak on the Nazi radio, or a General Paulus on the Soviet radio. Why is it so important for the propaganda of the Falagia to make use of articles in L'Observateur and L'Express, and for French propaganda to obtain statements from repentant Falaga? I don't even know. Extreme propaganda must win over the adversary and at least use him and integrate him into his own frame of reference. So that's like why the Christians are obsessed with getting atheists to agree with them. This is why it's so important to have an Englishman speak on the Nazi radio. So that's why they're always obsessed with like, well, even someone who's an atheist agrees with me. They always try to make this argument. Clearly, the ultimate was achieved by Soviet propaganda in the self-criticism of its opponents. That the enemy of a regime or of the faction in power can be made to declare, while he is still the enemy, that this regime was right, that his opposition was criminal, and that his condemnation is just that is and that his condemnation is just that is the ultimate result. His condemnation is just that is the ultimate result of totalitarian propaganda. So the ultimate goal is to get the enemy to agree with you. The enemy, while still remaining the enemy, and because he is the enemy, is converted into a supporter of the regime. This is not simply a very useful and effective means of propaganda. Let us also note that under the Khrushchev regime, the propaganda of self-criticism continued to function just as before. Marshal Bulganin's self-criticism was the most characteristic example. Here we are seeing the total, all-devouring propaganda mechanism in action. It cannot leave any segment of opinion outside its sphere. It cannot tolerate any sort of independence. Everything must be brought back into this unique sphere of action, which is an end in itself and can be justified only if virtually every man ends up participating in it. Take something out of the freezer real quick.
Hi, baby. Good boy. Good boy. I love you. Yes. I love you.
Oh, you're so beautiful. It's kind of hot in here. I'm sweating a little bit. This brings us to another aspect of total propaganda. The propagandist must combine the elements of propaganda as in real orchestration. On the one hand, he must keep in mind the stimuli that can be utilized at a given moment and must organize them. This results in a propaganda campaign. Okay. No, wait. Many analysis of various possible topics of gimmicks have been made. Seems a more profound analysis than that of Lenin's strategy of propaganda. First stage, the creation in each organization of solid cores of well-indoctrinated men. Second stage, cooperation with allies in political tasks that can compromise them. Third stage, when the maximum advantage is reached, propaganda to demoralize the adversaries, inevitably of the communists' victory and justice. The analysis of this type of campaign conducted by Hitler has been well done. Kurt Rees, Joseph Goebbels, about biography, demonstrating the precise timing of the moment when a campaign should start and when it should stop, the silences and the verbal assaults, a schedule of the use of rumors, neutral information, commentaries, monumental mass meeting, crowning all and aiming at concentrating the fire of all media on one particular point, a single theme, a single enemy, a single idea. The campaign uses this concentration of all media, but progressively for the public will take better to gradual attacks. I don't get that. On the other hand, the propagandists must use various instruments, each in relation to all the others. Alongside the mass media of communication, propaganda employs censorship, legal texts, proposed legislation, international conferences, and so forth, thus introducing elements seemingly alien to propaganda. We should not only consider the mass media, personal contacts are considered increasingly effective. Educational methods play an immense role in political indoctrination. A conference on Lenin's doctrine of the state is propaganda. Information is extremely helpful to propaganda, as we shall demonstrate. To explain correctly the present state of affairs is the great task of the agitator. Mao emphasizes that in 1928, an effective form of propaganda was the release of prisoners after they had been indoctrinated. The same was true of the care given to the enemy wounded. All this was to show the goodwill of the communists. Everything can serve as a means of propaganda, and everything must be utilized. In this way, diplomacy becomes inseparable from propaganda. We shall study this fact in Chapter 4. Education and training are inevitably taken over, as the Napoleonic Empire demonstrated for the first time. No contrast can be tolerated between teaching and propaganda, between the critical spirit formed by higher education and the exclusion of independent thought. One must utilize the education of the young to condition them to what comes later. The schools of all methods of instruction are transformed under such conditions, with the child integrating into the conformist group in such a way that the individualist is tolerated not by the authorities but by his peers. Religion and the churches are constrained to hold onto their own places in the orchestra if they want to survive. This was the case with the Orthodox Church in the USSR during the war. Napoleon expressly formulated the doctrine of propaganda by the church. The judicial apparatus is also utilized. In France, an example is the trial of Jensen Newark. Oh yeah, the George Floyd trial, propaganda. O.J. Simpson, propaganda. Okay, in France, an example is the trial of Jensen Network, which aided the propaganda against insubordination and aid to the FLN. It is interesting to find the same idea of educational trials in Goebbels and Soviet jurists. The law itself in the USSR is an instrument of propaganda intended to make people like the Soviet order. The tribunal is a means of preaching to the public. Finally, Mao has shown how the army can become a most effective propaganda instrument for those who are in it and for the occupied peoples. The French army tried to do the same in Algeria, but with less success. It is evident that information itself becomes propaganda, or rather, wherever propaganda appears, there follows an inextricable confusion between propaganda and information. Amusements, distractions, or games can be instruments of propaganda as well as films for children. And the games used in American social group social group work. Of course, a trial can be an admirable springboard of propaganda for the accused, who can spread his ideas in his defense and exert an influence by the way he suffers his punishment. This holds true in the democracies, but the situation is reversed when a totalitarian state makes propaganda. During a trial there, the judge is forced to demonstrate a lesson for the education of the public, Verdicts are educational, and we know the importance of confessions in the great show trials. Example: the Reichstag fire, the Moscow trials of 1936, the Nuremberg trials, and innumerable trials in the people's democracies after 1955. He calls the Nuremberg trials a great show trial. Totally true. Totally true. They do use these trials as like a way to fucking brainwash us, huh? God, I've almost been reading an hour. Okay, I'm gonna read 2.5 more pages, or 3.5 more pages. Alright, let's go. Finally, propaganda will take over literature, present and past, and history, which must be rewritten according to propaganda's needs. We must not say this is done by tyrannical, autocrat, totalitarian governments. In fact, it is the result of propaganda itself. Propaganda carries within itself, of intrinsic necessity, the power to take over everything that can serve it. Let us remember the innocent example of democratic, liberal, republican propaganda, which, without hesitation, took over many things in the 19th century, perhaps without realizing it and in good faith, but that is not an excuse. Let us remember the Athenian democracy, the Roman Republic, the movement of the medieval communes, the Renaissance, the Reformation. History was hardly less modified than Russian history was by the Bolsheviks. We know, on the other hand, how propaganda takes over the literature of the past, furnishing it with the contexts and explanations designed to reintegrate it into the present. From 1,000 examples, we will choose just one. Yes, like think about how now we've rewritten history to be like systemic slavery, patriarchy, white people are evil. They have done that throughout history. Like when the Bolsheviks took over, they rewrite the history. During the Reformation, all these periods in history, they keep rewriting the past like that, like we do today. So it's like at this point, like what he says, where propaganda exists, how can we tell the difference between information and propaganda? You can't. Can't tell the difference between history and propaganda. We know, on the other hand, how propaganda takes over the literature past furnishing. Yeah, I already read that. Okay. From 1,000 examples, we will choose just one. So we're going to talk an example about this. In an article in Pravda in May 1957, the Chinese writer Mao Dun wrote that the ancient poets of China used the following words to express the striving of the people toward a better life. The flowers perfume the air, the moon shines, man has a long life. And he added, allow me to give new explanation of these poetic terms. The flowers perfume the air. This means that the flowers of the art of socialist realism are incomparably beautiful. The moon shines. This means that the Sputnik has opened a new era in the conquest of space. Man has a long life. This means that the great Soviet Union will live tens and tens of thousands of years. When one reads this once, one smiles. If one reads it 1,000 times and no longer reads anything else, one must undergo a change, and we must reflect on the transformation of perspective already suffered by a whole society in which texts like this, published by thousands, can be distributed and taken seriously not only by the authorities but by the intellectuals. This complete change of perspective of the Weltanschauung is the primary totalitarian element of propaganda. Finally, the propagandist must not use only all of the instruments, but also different forms of propaganda. There are many types of propaganda, though there is a present tendency to combine them. Direct propaganda, aimed at modifying opinions and attitudes, must be preceded by propaganda that is sociological in character, slow, generally seeking to create a climate and atmosphere of favorable preliminary attitudes. No direct propaganda can be effective without pre-propaganda, which, without direct or noticeable aggression, is limited to creating ambiguities, reducing prejudices, and spreading images apparently without purpose. The spectator will be much more disposed to believe in the grandeur of France when he has seen a dozen films on French petroleum, railroads, or jetliners. The ground must be sociologically prepared before one can proceed to direct prompting. Sociological propaganda can be compared to plowing direct propaganda to sowing. You cannot do one without doing the other first. Both techniques must be used, for sociological propaganda alone will never influence an individual to change his actions. It leaves him at a level of his everyday life and will not lead him to make decisions. Propaganda of the word and propaganda of the deed are complementary. Talk must correspond to something visible. The visible active element must be explained by talk. Oral or written propaganda which plays on opinions, this word's blurred out, on opinions, sentiments must be reinforced by propaganda of action. Opinions or sentiments must be reinforced by propaganda of action, which produces new attitudes and thus joins the individual firmly to a certain movement. Here again, you cannot have one without the other. We must also distinguish between covert propaganda and overt propaganda. The former tends to hide its aims, identity, significance, and source. The people are not aware that someone is trying to influence them, and do not feel that they are being pushed in a certain direction. This is often called black propaganda. It also makes use of mystery and silence. The other kind, white propaganda, is open and above board. There is a ministry of propaganda. One admits that propaganda is being made. Its source is known, its aims and intention are identified. The public knows that an attempt is being made to influence it. The propagandist is forced to use both kinds, to combine them, for they pursue different objectives. Overt propaganda is necessary for attacking enemies. It alone is capable of reassuring one's own forces. It is a manifestation of strength and good organization, a token of victory. But covert propaganda is more effective if the aim is to push one's support in a certain direction without their being aware of it. Also, it is necessary to use sometimes one, sometimes the other on the same group. The Nazis knew very well how to alternate long silences, mystery, the secret revealed, the waiting period that rises anxiety levels, and then, suddenly, the explosive decision, the tempest, the storm that seems all the more violent because it breaks into the silence. Finally, we will know that the combination of covert propaganda and overt propaganda is increasingly conducted so that white propaganda actually becomes a cover and mask for black propaganda. That is, one only admits the existence of one kind of propaganda and of its organization, means, and objectives, but all this is only a facade to capture the attention of the individuals and neutralize their instinct to resist, while other individuals behind the scenes work. Work on public opinion in a totally different direction, seeking to arouse very different reactions, utilizing even existing resistance to overt propaganda. The secret element can be theoretically independent faction, a network of rumors, and so on. The same effect is obtained by contrasting the real methods of action, which are never acknowledged, with totally different overt propaganda proclamations. This is the most frequently used system in the Soviet Union. In this case, it is necessary to have an overt propaganda in accordance with Goebbels. We openly admit that we wish to influence our people. To admit this is the best method of attaining it. Hence, the creation of the official Ministry of Propaganda. In any case, as Goebbels said, when the news to be disseminated is unbelievable, it must be disseminated by secret, black propaganda. As for censorship, it should be as hidden and secret as possible. Moreover, all serious propagandists know that censorship should be used as little as possible. Censorship should be used as little as possible. I wonder what he would say today.
What's up, BB? Hey.
Okay, we're almost done. Okay, let us give one last example on this combination of differing types of propaganda. Lasswell divides propaganda into two main streams according to whether it produces direct incitement or indirect incitement. Direct incitement is that by which the propagandist himself acts, becomes involved, demonstrates his conviction, his belief, his good faith. He commits himself to the course of action and that he proposes and supports, and in order to obtain a similar action, he solicits a corresponding response from the propagandee. Democratic propaganda, in which the politician extends a hand to the citizen, is of this type. Indirect incitement is that which rests on a difference between the statesman who takes action and the public, which is limited to passive acceptance and compliance. There is a coercive influence and there is obedience. This is one of the characteristics of authoritarian propaganda. Although this distinction is not altogether useless, we must again point out that every modern propagandist combines the two types of propaganda because each responds to different sectors of action. These two types no longer belong to different political regimes, but are differing needs of the same propaganda and of the various levels on which propaganda is organized. Propaganda of action presupposes positive incitement. Propaganda through mass media will generally be contrasted incitement. Similarly, on the level of the performer in direct contact with the crowd, there must be positive incitement. It is better if the radio speaker believes in his cause. On the level of the organizer, that of the propaganda strategy, there must be separation from the public. We shall return to this point below. These examples suffice to show that propaganda must be total. Alright, we're going to stop there. I'm going to go check out Praise's stream.
Oh, baby, you're so beautiful. I love you. Look at this guy. Look at this guy. Hey, baby. I love you. I love you. Good boy. Oh. You're a good boy. You're a good boy. You're a very good boy. You're a very good boy, baby. Good boy.
Where did my bookmark go?
I'll use this.
This is better.